Thank you. I don't teach music. I teach music in the Holocaust, mainly through literature. Okay. Without memory, without what Kant termed reproduction in the imagination, no worthwhile knowledge can be obtained. By Theodore Adorno. It seems as if the Holocaust is never ending, certainly not for the survivors and their generations, but also in art and music. From 1945 to the present, music of or about the Holocaust continues to be composed and continues to be performed. These musical works related to the Holocaust have been composed as instruments of memory, as well as ways of coping with the past and with the present. In this paper, I will examine the changing fortunes of Holocaust music. I will first just mention the musical roots. Next, discuss how the reception of Holocaust musicians has changed over time. And finally, explore the works of some of its contemporary practitioners. First, the musical roots of Holocaust music. As was talked about earlier, the earliest music was composed during the Holocaust and performed in ghettos and camps, and some of these songs are still being performed. The Song of the Peat Bog Soldiers was created in Bergermoor Lager in 1933, and is one of the first songs created in the concentration camps. The song's title refers to the spades the prisoners carried on their shoulders looking like rifles. The lyrics speak of forced labor, the harsh conditions, the monotony, and their longing for family and freedom. The lyrics also reference the end of the Nazi regime, such as, "It cannot be winter forever." And I do have a handout with some of the lyrics. The song ends in an optimistic major resolution symbolizing the resistance of the political prisoners who, when performing the song, emphasized the word no and stamped their feet. Variations of the song were produced in Buchenwald, Neuengamme, Ravensbrück, and Sachsenhausen. In the post-war period, the Song of the Peat Bog Soldiers has served diverse cultural and political ends. For example, yesterday it was talked about in The Triumph of Death, but it's still being performed. The Partisan song was written in 1943 by a 21-year-old poet and partisan of the Vilna Ghetto, inspired to write the song by news of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The Song of the Vilna Ghetto spread to the labor camps and concentration camps, as well as to other partisan groups. The song later became a favorite song for Holocaust Day remembrance ceremonies in the U.S. and Israel. Anima Amin, a Hebrew song expressing belief in the coming of the Messiah, became the martyrs' hymn during the Holocaust when it was sung by those taken to their death in the gas chambers. This song is still frequently sung at Holocaust Remembrance Day services. Some also sing it at the Passover Seder in memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which began on the first night of Passover in 1943. Anima Amin, Das Lied der Moorsoldaten, the partisan song, and Anima Amin are just a few examples of the earliest music composed and sung during the Holocaust, music which is still being sung today. In the second part of my lecture, I examine the changing fortunes of band composers, for yet another way of creating Holocaust memorials is by the revival of works of these composers. The revival recovers music that was silenced during the Third Reich. After the horrors of World War I, during the Weimar Republic, many German composers expressed their freedom by experimentation and new forms of music. However, despite these efforts towards modernism, once the Nazis came to power, a generation of innovative musicians was virtually excluded from the Third Reich. One of these losses was the Austrian Jewish composer Franz Schäcker. Born to a converted Jew and a Catholic mother, in 1902, Schäcker began composing his first full-length opera, Der ferne Klang, using his own libretto as he did for his subsequent operas. Die Klang is considered one of the seminal works of 20th century opera. The article Franz Schrecker explains the collage of on and off stage vocal and instrumental ensembles, polyrhythmic juxtapositions, layering of styles, and improvised sounds in the second act bears comparison with the contemporaneous experiments by Charles Ives and with the emerging visual vocabulary of the cinema. Die Klang was followed by two other operas, including Gezeignetin in 1913-1915. Die Gezeignetin, according to Suzanne Starr, reflects the clash between a sublime vision and brutal reality, between the ideals of the Renaissance and the apocalyptic present, the time of the First World War. Schrecker's fame and influence were at their peak during the politically and economically unstable early years of the Weimar Republic. But in the mid-1920s, when Schrecker composed the opera Christophorus, which dealt with apocalyptic themes, and Die Singenden Teufel, with the theme of battle between the forces of light and darkness, performances of these operas had to be canceled because of Nazi demonstrations and anti-Semitic threats. With the collapse of the Weimar Republic and the rise of National Socialism, with its policy of anti-Semitism, Schrecker was forced out as director of the School for Music. Concerned about his pension and his future, Schrecker suffered a stroke and died in Berlin in March 1934. The last publicity he received in Nazi Germany was the inclusion of his music in the 1938 exhibition of degenerate Jewish music. Schrecker and his music then lapsed into obscurity for several decades. Schrecker has begun to enjoy a revival in Europe and the United States. In 1964, a revival of his opera, Die Klang, attracted attention, and the centennial of his birth in 1978 occasioned a re-examination of his life and work. In July 2005, the Salzburg Festival mounted a major production of Die Gezeignetin, and the Jewish Museum in Vienna presented an exhibition devoted to his life and work. New productions of Die Klang have been performed in many European and U.S. opera houses, including at the Bonn Opera in February 2011. Ernest Krenek, who had studied with Franz Schrecker at the Vienna Music Academy and was influenced by Theodor Adorno, was also a subject of the Degenerate Music exhibit. May 22, 1938 marked this exhibit's opening. The exhibit was modeled after the previous year's exhibit of degenerate art. Both exhibits intended to show the cultural degradation and moral threat posed to Germany by Jewish and other degenerate artists and musicians. The criteria for inclusion were race and modernism. Ironically, the composers whose opera was the source of the Nazi propaganda poster for degenerate music was neither Jewish nor black, because he was the Catholic Austrian Ernest Krenek, whose enormously popular opera, Johnny Spielt auf, became the inspiration for the Nazi propaganda poster, which showed a black jazz musician with the features of an ape, playing a saxophone and wearing a Jewish star, a crude exaggeration of the original poster. This figure became the Nazi symbol for all they considered degenerate in the arts. Krenek's opera, using special sound effects to depict traffic noises, trains, and sirens, was a mix of jazz, spiritual, and classical. Thus, the opera became one of the central targets of the 1938 exhibition. It was during the 1927 and 1928 performances in Vienna, performances of Johnny Spielt auf, that the audience clashed with Nazis who were protesting the Jewish Negro filth by the half-Jewish Czech. Performances in Germany, too, were interrupted by Nazis throwing stink bombs. Krenek fled Germany in 1928 for his homeland, Vienna. Krenek's first work, Austria. Krenek's first work in the 12-tone system, the opera Karl V, was conceived as anti-Nazi, pro-Austrian, and Catholic. Completed in 1933, the opera's premiere in 1934 was canceled by Nazi officials who recognized its subtext, and it was not performed in Vienna until almost 50 years later. After the 1938 Anschluss, Having already experienced fascism in Berlin, Krenek and his wife immigrated to the United States. In the United States, during Krenek's California years, he wrote over 100 compositions, including experimental electronic works and autobiographical pieces. Starting in the 1960s and for the remainder of his life, Krenek was honored in many ways, including a production of Karl V in Vienna in 1983. As a result of performance and recording projects that are exploring the music suppressed by the Nazis, Krenek's opera Johnny Spielt auf, although a period piece, has been the subject of renewed interest. Another composer the Nazis banned was Erich Korngold, an Austro-Hungarian Jewish film and romantic music composer. Korngold is considered one of the founders of film music, but before Hollywood, he was a well-known composer of concert and chamber music, operas and stage works, as well as an arranger and conductor. In 1920, Korngold completed his most celebrated operatic work, Die Todesstadt, a hit in the German-speaking world as well as in London and in New York. The theme of the opera was overcoming the loss of a loved one, and it resonated with audiences of the 1920s who had just come through the trauma of World War I. In 1934, Korngold began writing musical arrangements for film. His first was arranging Mendelssohn's music for the film Midsummer Night's Dream. And Troy Dixon writes that Midsummer Night's Dream's symphonic score was an entirely new approach to film music. Korngold also scored the music for other films, including Anthony Adverse, and this won him his first Oscar. In 1937, he returned to Vienna to work on the opera Die Katrin. In early 1938, with German troops gathered at the Austrian border, Korngold accepted another contract from Warner Brothers and got his family out of Austria. While he was working in the U.S. in 1938, the Nazis seized his Austrian home and property. In the final act of Die Katrin, a song speaks to Korngold's exile. Where is my home, my house? Where is a table for me, a bed prepared? Whose hand will lead my heart to rest? Back in Hollywood, Korngold composed the score for The Adventures of Robin Hood, which won him his second Oscar. He became a popular and respected composer, generating scores that have become classics. In 1947, he returned to Austria, but ironically was criticized for leaving and enjoying a lush Hollywood lifestyle. He was also criticized for his traditional tonal music style. He died in 1957 at age 60. By the 1970s, his music grew in prominence. His son released recordings of his father's best movie music, and the recovery of his film classics led to new recordings of his concert works. Die Katrin and his other operas have now been recorded along with most of his chamber music. Further recognition came in the 90s with 2 biographies of Korngold. And on his 50th anniversary in November of 2007, the anniversary of his death, the London Philharmonic gave 3 Korngold concerts. And more recently, his operas have been performed in Bonn, San Francisco, Paris, Frankfurt, and in Vienna. These band composers, just a few of the many, Franz Schrecker, Ernest Krenek, and Erich Korngold, are no longer silenced. Their vanished music is heard once again. Reintroduced to the public in Europe and the United States, these composers are receiving the recognition and fame denied them during the Third Reich. Their revival is another way of recalling and remembering the Holocaust. The third part of my lecture explores the works of contemporary composers of Holocaust memorials. These musical compositions related to the Holocaust were written as ways of coping with the past and present. Because of the difficulties of representing the Holocaust, as Adorno posits, many of these Holocaust memorials are innovative. One of the 20th century's most important composers is Arnold Schoenberg. Although Schoenberg immigrated to the United States just after Hitler came to power in 1933, he understood Nazi persecution. Schoenberg stated, "I have at last learned the lesson that has been forced upon me this year, and I shall never forget it. It is that I am not a German, not a European, indeed perhaps scarcely even a human being. At least the Europeans prefer the worst of their race to me, but that I am a Jew. The work that Schoenberg dedicated to the Holocaust is a survivor from Warsaw, a vocal cantata, using accompanied speech or melodrama, pioneered by Brecht, Weil, and Hindemith. Survivor is a work of protest and resistance honoring the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943. In Survivor, Schoenberg presents a fictionalized version of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising from the point of view of a traumatized narrator. The narrator struggles to recall the experience, but says that he cannot remember everything. I must have been unconscious most of the time. I remember only the grandiose moment when they all started to sing, as if prearranged, the old prayer that had been neglected for so many years, the forgotten creed. After this, the narrator describes the conditions of the ghetto and the brutal beating of Jewish prisoners. The work concludes with the victims singing Shema Israel. Adorno concluded in 1955 that A Survivor from Warsaw was probably the only work of art, along with Picasso's Guernica, that was capable of looking unflinchingly at its most extreme horror and yet was aesthetically compelling. Another Holocaust memorial and vocal cantata, and we've heard something about this earlier too, Jüdisch Chronik, was inspired by anti-Semitic violence in 1959 in the Federal Republic of Germany. This violence culminated in the desecration of the reconstructed Rundstrasse synagogue in Cologne. The synagogue, destroyed during the November pogrom of 1938, reopened in September 1959. However, a few weeks later, on Christmas Eve, hoodlums smeared swastikas and the word Jews out and daubed paint on a monument to Jewish victims. Between Christmas Eve and the end of January 1960, 234 teenagers and young adults had been arrested for 685 separate anti-Semitic incidents defacing Jewish synagogues and cemeteries. Leonard Bernstein said, "This will be our response to violence, to make music more intensely, more beautifully, and more devotedly than ever before." That was composer Paul Dessau's response. Dessau, a Jew, a leftist, a progressive composer of the German Democratic Republic, organized the composition of Jüdisch Chronik, a 5-part cantata whose text protested Jewish persecution during both the Holocaust and post-war periods. To underscore the universality of the Chronik's message, Dessau invited artists from both East and West Germany to collaborate on the cantata. These composers shared the conviction that music could affect political and social change. According to Henze, the composer of the 4th movement, the project was attractive to all the composers because it provided the opportunity to confront directly the threats of fascism. We remembered how too often in the past, artists had kept their own counsel and how disastrous their silence had often been in the Third Reich. We all believe that any kind of warning would be preferable to the kind of non-political evasiveness that indicates only indifference and insensitivity. Jüdisch Chronik was finished in 1961, however, because of the construction of the Berlin Wall, as well as Kern's wish not to exacerbate international tensions during the trial of Eichmann, it was not premiered until 1966. By this time, Hartmann had died, and Peter Weiss's The Investigation in 1965 had established a precedent for East-West collaboration in the treatment of the Holocaust. The chronological text of Jüdisch Chronik develops the plot during 5 movements. The orchestra is made up of woodwind, brass, and percussion. Absent are violins, cellos, and French horns, according to Calico, avoided for their evocation of the emotional and manipulative romantic style. The most distinctive feature is its use of melodrama or accompanied speech. Calico notes that the speaking chorus is a means of unmediating the work of art, or more nearly approaching the real. Elizabeth Janik calls Jüdisch Chronik path-breaking in several regards, not only in its challenge to East-West musical barriers, but also in its identification with Judaism and open confrontation with the Nazi past. During this last part, I will discuss the recent Holocaust-related musical memorials that have been written by avant-garde composers such as Alvin Curran, Steve Reich, Gary Lucas, John Zorn, and George Frederick Haas. These musicians were influenced by the controversial and radically innovative John Cage. American composer, philosopher, poet, music theorist, and artist, inspired by Marcel Duchamp and a student of Schoenberg. Cage blurred the distinction between what is music and what is not music. And we heard one of his works, Notes on the Holocaust, performed a couple nights ago. All right. Alvin Curran, a contemporary American composer of Jewish descent, is one who has been influenced by Cage. Curran's more than 150 works feature tapes, natural sounds, piano, synthesizers, violin, percussion, shofar, ship horns, accordion, and chorus. He says he makes music from old rags, mortar, and sleight of hand. From the mid-80s, Curran has been involved in a mix of projects, including Crystal Psalms, Memory of the Holocaust. On October 20th, 1988, the 50th anniversary of Kristallnacht, Western Europe heard, well, not exactly, because Kristallnacht was in November. Western Europe heard the Holocaust Commemoration Crystal Psalms, a collaborative concerto for musicians in 6 nations, simultaneously performed, mixed, and broadcast from 7 European radio stations live, scored for 6 choruses and 6 sestets. Curran writes, through its unusual concept, the work demonstrated an exceptional quality of international artistic and technological collaboration. Curran describes the work as follows. The music is structured in 2 sections, the first lasting 24 minutes, and dominated by the percussion using fallen and thrown objects, is an 18-voice polyphonic structure where the musical fragments in each voice are repeated cyclically and woven by chance into an increasingly denser texture. The remaining 29 minutes shift without warning from one musical discourse to another, from the sound of an idling car to a Yiddish lullaby to a ram's horn to breaking glass, from a familiar warm melody to random sonic collusions. An Offenbach tune bleeds into a forgotten shtetl song and winds up in 16th century Italy with foghorns and Strauss waltzes across a field of menacing crows. Curran explains his motivation for the work. This event, for me, a very special form of human artistic collaboration, now exists alongside the memory of the inhuman pogrom of 1938, which inspired it. One can only wish that it had been otherwise, that instead we could be remembering and celebrating some noble acts of humanity and love. He continues, by focusing on this almost incomprehensible moment in our recent history, I simply wish to make a clear personal music statement and to solicit a conscious act of remembering not only this moment of unparalleled human madness of 50 years ago, but of all crimes against humanity anywhere, anytime. Without remembering, there is no learning. Without learning, no remembering. And without remembering and learning, there is no survival. He's done a number of works, and this other one, Floor Plans, Notes from the Underground, 1991, is also a Holocaust memorial, but I had to cut it because there's not enough time. A contemporary of Alan Curran, Steve Reich, is another avant-garde composer who has memorialized the Holocaust. A pioneering composer of minimalist music, Reich's 1938 piece, Different Trains, a 3-movement piece for string quartet and tape, marked a new compositional method. Different Trains was the first piece in which Reich used recorded speech to create melodic lines. Nicholas Kitchen writes, after each melody in the piece is introduced, usually by a single instrument, viola for women and cello for men, a recording of the spoken phrase from which the melody derives is played. The Different Trains theme originates from Reich's childhood during the years from 1939 to 1942, when he spent the time traveling with his governess between his estranged parents from New York to Los Angeles. Reich writes that these were exciting trips full of adventure, but many years later it dawned on him that had he been in Germany, his Jewish background would have ensured that the trains he would have been riding on would have been very different trains. For different trains, Reich collected recordings which recreate and document the atmosphere of his travels as a contrast with those of the deportees. Reich combined the sound of train whistles, pistons, and the scream of brakes with extracts of interviews of Pullman Porter, Lawrence Davis, Reich's governess Virginia, and 3 Holocaust survivors. These speech recordings generate the musical material for the musical instruments. Rhythmic patterns and the pitch of the voices establish the phrases and course of the music heard in the quartet. For example, Crack Train from New York and 1939 are heard in the steam-driven opening movement, America Before the War. The middle section, Europe During the War, is the refugees in the throes of deportation being herded into cattle wagons. European train sounds and sirens are heard in the movement. The trains whistle like shrieks, and the sirens help to convey the despair and confusion of the deportees. Reconciliation is achieved in After the War, the third movement, when the survivors immigrate to America. American train sounds from the first movement return. Another avant-garde composer of Holocaust musical memorials is Gary Lucas, called the thinking man's guitar hero. He established his reputation as a guitarist with 5 years spent playing with the visionary avant-garde vocalist, composer, and band leader Captain Beefheart. Lucas was invited to appear at the November '88 Berlin Jazz Fest, where his solo piece, Verklarte Kristallnacht, was broadcast live on the 50th anniversary of Kristallnacht. The piece stunned the audience. This 1988 composition juxtaposes the Israeli national anthem, Haktifa, with phrases from Deutschland über alles, amid wild electronic shrieks and noise. The ironic title is a reference to Arnold Schoenberg's 1899 work, Verklarte Nacht, Transfigured Night. Lucas explains the origin of the piece. I noticed upon arrival that the Berlin Jazz Fest was coinciding with the 50th anniversary of Kristallnacht, and I determined to make some kind of a statement about it music-wise. I didn't really premeditate it beyond feeling that it was my artistic duty then and there as a sensitive Jewish artist obsessed with his roots to make some kind of statement, particularly in Berlin, a city I found devastatingly beautiful, but haunted by ghosts, and which seemed to offer a kind of unlimited license for experimentation. Beefheart taught me the idea that music could go well beyond the veneer of pop, slick, manufactured, so-called commercial music, and could touch areas of emotion that usually people don't want to look at or would repress or wouldn't want to bring up, he said, calling Beefheart's Dachau Blues one of the most powerful evocations of the Holocaust in music and poetry that I ever heard. You had that in that handout. In 2010, Lucas wrote another Holocaust memorial, The Haunting Requiem, Żałobny. And it's on the Ordeal of Civility album. This bleak song has a waltz rhythm and a mournful melody. Lucas writes, when I was a boy, I often pondered the fate of my European relatives on my mother's side. My family, I knew, had originally been named Piekarski, and they had lived for many generations in a little town called Żałobny near Białystok in northeastern Poland. I knew that my grandfather Samuel had been more or less smuggled out of Żałobny and Poland, disguised by dressing him up as a little girl. I used to ask my grandpa, what became of the Piekarskis, and why, in fact, had we no more living European relatives on my mother's side of the family? He said, they took all the Jews in Żałobny and burned them up in a barn during the war. That's why. Accompanied by solo guitar, Lucas tells the story through verse and song of the murder of the Polish Jews who had lived in that town of Żałobny in 1941. And you had those lyrics in your handout. John Zorn, an American composer, arranger, and performer, is one of the most important figures associated with avant-garde music. His music is wide-ranged, including jazz, rock, hardcore, punk, classical, klezmer, film, cartoon, popular, and improvised. Although Jewish by birth, John Zorn had not been involved with either religious or secular Jewish culture until the early 1990s, when he began exploring his Jewish roots in his music. His first composition to address Jewish subject matter was Kristallnacht in 1992. The album Kristallnacht is a pastiche of songs and disparate sound elements that has been dubbed a brutal sound portrait of the Holocaust, ranging from references to traditional Jewish music to chaotic, discordant, violent screeching, and even ear-shattering noises. John Zorn told the BBC in 2000, Kristallnacht is tied together with passion and research. Every Jew has to come to grips with the Holocaust in some kind of way, and that was my statement. That's how I did it. I do not need to do it again. It meant a lot to me. It was like a whole lifetime of denying my Jewish heritage coming out in one piece. Another composer of Holocaust-related music is George Friedrich Haas. Haas has written nothing specifically about the Holocaust. However, at least two of his compositions were inspired by anti-fascist activity. A daringly innovative composer of rich imaginative power, aware of his responsibilities as a citizen, Haas is one of the leading artists in Europe today, writes Alec Ross for The New Yorker. Reinhard Kager points out that night, darkness, the loss of illusions have played important roles in Haas's oeuvre, such as in his opera Nacht, the cello concerto, In Vain, and in the Third Nocturne. The cello concerto for percussion and ensemble reflects Haas's political commitment. The concerto was written at the time of the Balkan War. Haas asked himself whether anyone could hear him if he were to cry out and protest against the war. The cello concerto begins with a scream in unbearable pain, followed by a section where the drum beat echoes the rhythm of an army marching, a plea against fascism. From the darkness of Nacht and the cello concerto, Kager writes, quite recently, Haas's music has been illuminated by light. Light effects as integral components in his composition have featured prominently, for example, In Vain, 2000. Haas's most radical statement, the most structurally daring ensemble piece, In Vain, was written similar to Jüdisch Chronik at a time of political crisis, specifically the rise of the right-wing Freedom Party in the 1990 Austrian elections. In Vain conveys, in part, Alex Ross writes, Haas's despair in the face of decaying hopes for social progress. The title also bears a trace of biblical injunction, a warning of the wages of pride. Yet that exalting glimpse of a nocturnal paradise of sound lingers in the mind. In Vain, it reflects opposition's light against darkness, dissonance against pure intervals, and a modern tuning against national resonances. As in his string quartet number 3 in Third Nocturne, players cannot see the score, and so they work from memory. In his 2001 string quartet number 3, Haas has continued his experiments with music performed in the dark. Darkness, however, is not present as an absence of light, but is the key theme. Haas explains the whole piece is played in complete darkness. The musicians can see neither their music nor their fellow performers and are seated as far apart from one another as possible. For example, they might be seated around the audience in the four corners of the auditorium. Ross writes that some of the music sounds like noise because the strings creak and groan, and there are clickety swarms of pizzicato, shrill high notes, mourning glissandos. However, he writes, at other times, the piece attains an otherworldly beauty as the players spin out glowing overtone harmonies. Ross concludes that Haas's modern masterworks transform the concert hall into a place of shuddering mystery, suggesting that the way of truth goes through the dark. Similarly, the musical memorials from during the Holocaust and after take us through the darkness of the Holocaust and fascism to a place of some light and hope. However, the fact that these compositions are still being written is testimony to the continued strength of the forces of darkness and our fear, certainly my fear at times, that we will be overwhelmed by the abyss. These musical memorials continue to be bulwarks of light, revelations of the strength of goodness in our world. And yes, these composers from Schoenberg to Haas have changed the aesthetics of music. In order to create composition that effectively imaged their visions, they had to make it new, as Pound said. Curran speaks about the young lions, honorable anti-fascists, who set themselves the task of putting some artistic order and meaning back into the horror-filled streets. Curran says that even in their expressions of atonal madness and clustered fragmentation, and despite their efforts to compose music like pure science, rays of transcendental lyricism break through the disorder, exuding warmth, security, and humanity. Einstein said, logic will get you from A to B, imagination will take you everywhere. Thus, as Curran says, we can be forms of flesh and blood and pure sound simultaneously. Okay, thank you.